Hello and welcome to today's webinar entitled Dixie Mission in China. My name is Lauren Cornegay-Dollar and I'm the Adult Programs Coordinator here at the National Museum of the Pacific War. I'm really glad to see you all today, and as usual, I'm going to give a couple of shout outs to our at-home audience. So let's see who we have, or where they're coming in from, I should say. We've got friends in Santa Barbara, hello, and in Houston, my hometown. Let's see, there's Lincoln, Nebraska, how are you? At Fort Worth, we've got Fredericksburg, Richmond, Texas. We have some friends with us from Pennsylvania and North Carolina. Oh, we've got a couple from North Carolina, awesome. And then Washington as well, and over in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Hello, how are you doing today? As you guys know, I like to give our presenters as much time as possible. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the reins over to our guest speaker today, Jim Bevill. You guys may remember him from last year. He did a presentation with us last season.
Thank you, Lauren. I'm really glad to be here. This is a story, the Dixie Mission in China during World War II, that just isn't really well known. It's an excerpt, only about 12 pages out of the 300-page book, Blackboards and Bomb Shelters, but it's something that a lot of people aren't familiar with. And the question I get most often is when I pull this up is, why the rebel flag? Why do we have a rebel flag there? This was in the middle of the Chinese Civil War. The Chinese Communist Party tried to bring a radical change to Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party since 1927. It was an on-again, off-again war that was terribly disruptive to the Chinese people. It's not like the Russian Revolution. It didn't happen overnight. This is a bitter civil war that drew the Nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and the Communist movement into a direct military confrontation. Now, in October of 1934, there were about 86,000 communist troops, which are surrounded by nationalist forces in southern China. And they managed to break through the nationalist lines at their weakest points, fled westward, and then northwards towards Yenan, up here in northern China. This was called the Long March. It was not as idealistic as all as it seemed in reality. Thousands of communists are wounded, killed, starved, or froze to death. But it was led by Mao Zedong, during which numerous communist armies in the south consolidated and escaped to the north and to the west. And this solidified Mao's position as the premier eminent leader of this Communist Central Party, with Zhou Enlai in second position to him. This left Chiang's forces, Chiang Kai-shek's forces, in control of all of southern and central China back here. Well, what happened next was when they had this stalemate for a few years, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China in August of 1937. This forced the nationalists and the communists into an uneasy ceasefire with each other to defeat their mutual enemies, the Japanese. This was the beginning of World War II in Asia, when Japan invaded China full bore, the rape of Nanking, captured all the areas, and they ended up sending everything to the capital, to the wartime capital of Chongqing. Now, December 7, 1941, the U.S. enters the war against Japan after Pearl Harbor. China became an ally of the United States, and the Chinese were thrilled to have the American allies on their side against the Japanese. Let me fast forward a little bit to the American embassy in Chongqing, China in 1943. This is an old family photo. You can see a man named Jack Service. He's standing next to the rear tire. And Jack was the second secretary in the embassy. He was born in China in the city of Chengdu. By the age of 11, Service is fluent in English. He attended the Shanghai American School before moving to Berkeley, California, where he finished high school at the American School before moving to Berkeley, California. He graduated from Oberlin College. He entered the U.S. Foreign Service. He was sent to Peking for language study. He was then assigned to Shanghai. When Service got transferred to Chongqing, Clarence Gauss became the new ambassador and brought service with him. Paul Springer is the gentleman behind the car in the hat. He's my wife's father. He's one of the central characters in the first half of the book. Springer's position at the embassy was a top secret code clerk. They had highly classified diplomatic and military intelligence that went back and forth between the embassy and the State Department in Washington, and Springer sent a lot of those messages. Now, Springer was mentored by John Carter Vincent. He was the second secretary in the American Embassy in Chongqing. He also hired Springer. Vincent had graduated from Mercer University in 1923, was appointed as a Foreign Service officer, and he served for 19 years in various consulate positions in China before moving to the American Embassy in Chongqing in 1942. Now, Colonel Barrett was a big player in this drama. He was the American military attaché in China. He was a member of the embassy staff. He acted as a daily advisor on military affairs, and Barrett served most of his professional career in China. This was a difficult job. It was not that China lacked armed forces, but instead of one army, it was plagued with a multitude of armies, and they were currently fighting each other. It was almost a warlord situation at one point in time. And their leadership, or their lack of leadership, varied greatly, and the command structure was a mixture of factional politics, personal relationships, and ties. Barrett worked actively with the Nationalist troops. Here he is standing here, fourth from the left. He's working with this infantry training group in Chongqing, but he had a long immersion in the country, had a capacity to unlearn many conventional military attitudes, and he was extremely fluent in the native Chinese. Now, the city of Chongqing is surrounded by a river, and one side is the Yangtze River, and you can see here, you can barely see it on the side, there's an arrow pointing to the Chongqing Club. Barrett's embassy office was over here. Right here was the Chongqing Club. And this was a relaxed private club. It was for officers. It was for diplomats where they could sit down in a relaxed setting and interact with the high-level Chinese officials. Several senior military officers and embassy staff attended a luncheon at that club in January of 43, hosted by Zhou Enlai, the Communist Chinese representative in Chongqing. The American guests included Colonel Barrett, John Davies, and a number of other diplomats. Now, Zhou Enlai at that luncheon, he outlined the acrimonious politics that was undermining the Chinese efforts to defend their homeland from the Jap, because the communist military forces had received no military support, no financial support from Chiang's government for the past 3.5 years. By and large, the two sides really hated each other. Zhou said that communist troops could be more active in the military struggle against the Japanese, especially in guerrilla warfare, if they were supplied with arms and ordnance. He believed the Japanese was going to try to crush all the Chinese resistance, and he had a lot of information about Japanese troop division movements which had recently moved from North China down to the south. Now, the intelligence was eye-opening to the Americans. Zhou Enlai was the public face of the Chinese Communist Party, and he was considered a moderate by some. Mao Zedong was at the opposite end of the spectrum. At the time, Mao's radical nature was largely unknown to the Americans. He played his political cards very close to his vest while courting the Americans for help. Lin Pao, on the right, General Lin Pao, also spoke during the luncheon. He was third in command of the Communist forces. He was small in appearance, 35 years old, but he had done his officer's training at the Wanpa Military Academy in Canton and was already a battle-hardened veteran. General Lin told the Americans that the Chinese Communists had no supplies of copper. Their production of military equipment was limited to hand grenades and mines. They said that if they were supplied with arms, if they were supplied with ammunition and medicine, they could go on the offensive, be able to strike hard blows the Japanese through northern China for their American allies. And the intelligence he offered was alarming. They maintained 8 or 9 divisions in North China, about 4 of which were in Shanxi, where they were located. He warned the Americans that the Japanese goal was to eliminate all resistance. But they tried to lobby the Chiang government for supplies, for bullets, for ammunition. Chiang refused to give them to him because there was this political divide that just kept growing wider and wider and wider. So here's a family photo. This is Clarence Gauss, where the arrow is, the mouse arrow is the ambassador. This is Paul Springer, my father-in-law. This is John Carter Vincent, who hired Springer. This man over here is John Davies. He's one of the junior diplomats at the embassy. In March of 43, 2 months later, John Davies had a follow-up conversation with Zhou Enlai in Chongqing. And out of the blue, Davies posed a blunt question. He says, if we, the United States, were able to extend lend-lease aid impartially to the Chinese army, irrespective of the political complexion, and including those seen most anxious to fight the enemy, could we do so? Cho shook his head, implying that Chiang Kai-shek's distrust of the troops under the communists was too strong. Cho was concerned that the Japanese might attack Yenan in southwestern China. That's where Kunming was. The Japanese already controlled Burma. If they controlled Yenan, they would control Kunming. They'd already cut the Burma road. That would eliminate supplies coming in from over the hump, because they would go from Calcutta or in India into Kunming. So that was a big deal. So that really put a sense of urgency on the request. But if they could just get permission from Chiang's government, because there was a prior agreement, the SACO agreement, the Sino-American Cooperative Organization, what that meant was all U.S. forces, General Chennault, Stilwell, all of them were under Chiang Kai-shek's command. He had to give the okay. So after their meeting, the embassy, might have been my father-in-law, sends a cable to the U.S. Secretary of State stating that we want to have American military observers in North China to get more information regarding the Japanese forces and to bring about some military cooperation between the Kuomintang, the Nationalists, and the Communists. The goal was to cause the Nationalist government to divert their attention away from political affairs and towards military affairs to drive the Japanese out of China. So that table gets sent. President Roosevelt sends Vice President Henry Wallace here in the center and John Carter Vincent on your right to Chongqing and then to Moscow to discuss foreign policy during the visit. They do a state visit to Moscow, then they can come back to Chongqing. Wallace brings the message to President Roosevelt and from President Roosevelt to Chiang, and tells Chiang that President Roosevelt has requested American observers to go up to Yenan and meet with the communists. And it was only after he got that direct request from Roosevelt that Chiang agreed to it. And Wallace was not impressed with Chiang's government at all. He saw a lot of corruption. He also learned that if the Russians were going to enter the war against Japan, they would have to attack through the communist-held areas in North China. The Americans needed a first-hand look. Now they had the green light. So that request goes up to him, and Stilwell is the one that actually gives. Stilwell and Wallace give the report to Chiang. So now they've got the clearance to go up there. And so Stilwell makes a visit to the embassy, and he summons Jack Service. And he says, we need to get this mission together. Who shall head it? Jack Service says Colonel Barrett. He's the only logical man for this delicate and important assignment. He speaks Chinese. He reads and writes Chinese. He's very familiar. So Stilwell knew him well. He agreed, and they issued orders. Colonel Barrett was in charge of gathering military information on the Communist Army. His goal was to assess their forces and work on building a cooperative military strategy. Jack Service was there to do a political analysis on the CCP. This exploratory venture was known by the code name of the Dixie Mission. This is a tongue-in-cheek reference to Union missions behind Confederate lines during the war. They reasoned that if the Japanese intercepted the messages with the phrase Dixie Mission, They would never be able to guess what in the world that meant. But this was this is what it was about. So July 22nd, 1944, 6 months after that luncheon, 9 Americans, led by Jack Service and Colonel Barrett, land on an airstrip in Yenan in northern Shanxi on the south central part of the Lost Plateau. They are the American Observation Group. Okay. They are met by the 8th Route Honor Guard. Heading the reception were General Chu Tia, here on the left, and Mao Zedong on the right. They were wearing new matching uniforms for the occasion. Barrett's right here in the middle of them. General Chu commanded the Communist Army's northern forces. He also retained command of all Communist military operations until the war ended in 1945. Afterwards, he commanded the entire People's Liberation Army, which won their victory over the Nationalists in 1949. But that goes on a little bit later. This first group of Americans were supplemented by another 10 about a month later to gain further insight into the communists. Now, Jack Service, here in the back, is the one wearing the sunglasses. He traveled extensively through the area. He asked endless questions. His first impressions of the group were positive, almost like, quote, they had come into a different country and were meeting different people. Service said that, quote, Mao and the other leaders are universally spoken of with respect. These men are approachable. Subservience toward them is lacking. And he said, we ran into confidence, difference in morale, a spirit. We thought we had gone into a different country. Now, the Americans were impressed with simplicity of the clothing and the life and the lack of beggars and desperate poverty. Some of the more poverty-stricken Chinese, some of the peasants, and the coolie class, they had been recruited into the Communist Army. He said morale is very high. I love this picture of these four Americans. This is Lieutenant Ray Ludden, Lieutenant Herb Hitch. This is Colonel Barrett. This is Zhou Enlai, and this is Jack Service, taken in about 1944. Now, Barrett and his officers spent time in the field with the Chinese Communist troops, either observing or training or actually accompanying them on missions to repel the Japanese. Barrett was the prototype U.S. Army colonel. He was adorned by a warm humanity and an overwhelmingly infectious humor. This guy was funny. He could crack jokes in Chinese. The communists loved him. When he cracked jokes in fluent and Chinese, including the dialect, it just destroyed their preconceived notions of a calculating American imperialist. His sense of humor disarmed the Chinese leaders, even Mao Zedong. I love this picture of Mao Zedong laughing at one of Colonel Barrett's jokes. It's the only picture of Chairman Mao where you'll see him laughing, and I'm happy to see this in here. Barrett did an inspection. I love this one of these pictures that they did. They went on an inspection. Now, the part in the yellow is what was written on the back. Ray Ludden and Colonel Barrett, that's them right here, are astounded at the sight of soldiers doing useful work. This was probably the first Chinese sweatshop where they were sewing clothes. You know, you read about in the papers and the trade wars and all that, but this may have been one of the first sweatshops in China. The soldiers, when they weren't drilling, they were sewing. But what were they sewing? After the second contingent of Americans arrived, they retreated to custom-made commie uniforms. And it's kind of interesting. We know they're modeling commie uniforms, but on the back of the photo, Barrett, this guy wrote, the Welsh Coal Miners Chorus just up from the pits. So he's making a joke that they came up from coal mining because he didn't want anybody to really mistake them for being communist, even though they were caught red-handed in communist uniforms. It wasn't all fun and games, though. Here we have a photo of General Lin Pao, right here, standing up, emphasizing political training for communist troops. Jack Service is here. He's taking notes as he speaks to these Americans. Service is translating for some of these guys. And Barrett was surprised at this because he was involved in troop training and indoctrination. To Barrett's surprise, the Chinese commanders emphasized political training for the troops, because the political consciousness of the peasants who made up the communist armies was very low. So therefore, political training was needed. Barrett told him, we don't do that. In the U.S. Army, we disfavor on political training. We think we should devote the whole time to military training. He said, no, we're not going to do that. He told Barrett, this is not the case in our Army. We consider military training and politically training is equally important, and one cannot be neglected for the other. That was true in the Chinese Communist Army. That was true in the People's Revolution. That was true in North Vietnam. That was true in Ho Chi Minh's revolutionaries. It was very important to them that they knew the political cause they were going to fighting for. And the Chinese knew we're not going to neglect one for the other. But Barrett's reports were honest, hard-headed military assessments. As a soldier, he recognized the communists as an effective fighting force, sound allies against the common enemy. So he really respected them. This was a reviewing stand near Yenan, and written in Chinese at the right. It says China, America, Russia, England united arise. Think about that. China, America, Russia, England united arise. They were all on the same side in this war. At left, it says wipe out fascism. Now, the communists provided their new allies with food and shelter. During their stay, they got to know each other. They had meals together, and sometimes it was a lunch. Sometimes it was nothing more than a lunch. But to add some variety in their diet, there was an occasional pheasant hunt. The Allied visitors, in true military fashion, went after the pheasants with a carbine, whereas the Chinese, seen less sporting, would pepper them on the ground with a 12-gauge shotgun. This is an interesting photograph. Chairman Mao, right here, is seen to the right of the officer on the camera, and he's surrounded by American soldiers. They had Saturday night parties in a pear orchard. The Americans ate watermelon, and they danced to the folk music of local musicians. Chou Enlai was described as light of foot. Chairman Mao danced in a sort of grizzly bear shuffle and was eager to take a turn around the dance floor with any young lady who asked him. Service attempted to get a feel for the political leaders in the Communist Party. He described them as having a striking lack of individuality, but overall they gave the impression of youth and vigor and pragmatism. He was impressed with the level of leadership. They embraced the peasants, and the guerrilla captives had kept such a fierce resistance against the Japanese that the Japanese had never been able to incur where they were. So Barrett saw that they were fairly well equipped with light arms. So they were short of supplies. They were really short on ammunition. So he opined, my strongest impression, these people are interested mainly in two things: fighting the Japanese and gaining support of the people. That's what he wrote in one of his reports. So to sum it up, by September, he went ahead and sent the recommendation that he thought it would speed up the war against Japan. If their assistance can save American lives, speed up the victory, and he was convinced they could be allies. So he went ahead and he submits that recommendation. I love this photo. Colonel Barrett informs Mao that his recommendation is to arm and to supply the communist forces to assist in the Allied war effort. And on the back, he wrote, is everybody happy? Now, Cho Day, he must have been a heck of a political leader, too, and in general, because every photograph of him that you see, he is cracking a smile. So that went back. As for the CCP's policy goals, Jack Service was quick to point out what could happen with the implementation of communist theory. Quote, their espousal of democracy appeals to the great majority of the people of China and is a good club for beating the Kuomintang. Their proclamations of liberal economic policies based on private property are also useful in appealing to foreign sympathy. He said they can afford to sit back and wait. If things continue as they're going, time will bring the collapse of the Kuomintang, leaving the communists the strongest force in China. Then they'll be free, immediately or gradually as circumstances seem to dictate, to revert to their program of communism. This is what happened in unquote. This is what happened in the People's Republic. This is what happened in North Vietnam. This is what happened to their communist takeovers. They want to bring everybody in, espouse those policies, and bring them into the effort in the name of nationalism. And once they've got control, they revert to the program of communism. Service was also suspicious of their long-term motivations. But the intelligence that came from the Dixie Mission was the most accurate and the most revealing that the U.S. had access to. Ambassador Gauss received copies of the service reports. These reports were sent via cable to Washington. Service had a somewhat rosy view of the situation, but he found that the communists were both repressive and genuinely popular among their own people. Service also underestimated the political and military advantage that the Communist Army had, because they had avoided the massive air raids and the strikes and the refugee flights that hampered Chiang Kai-shek's regime from the start of the war. He was also not privy to the inter-party discussions that made it clear that Mao would never entertain a genuine alliance with Washington, because his ideological alignments were towards Stalin and communism. But the problem with arming the communists was not lost on Chiang's government. As the communists increased their military capacity, they would expand the Chinese territory under control and be a bigger threat to the nationalist government. Now, even without American aid, this is exactly what happened. As more and more Japanese troops were withdrawn from China, from North China, to bolster the defense of the Pacific Islands, the communist troops began to fill the vacuum that was created, seizing Japanese weapons and ammunition in the process, because Mao was planning a more violent and indigenous revolution for all of China when the war was over with Japan. So the ultimatum came out to Chiang Kai-shek, and he turned it down. He vetoed it. He said, "You cannot arm my enemies." And because of the prior agreement, they had to drop the whole idea. But in late 1944, it was kind of an abrupt turn of events. Chiang was incensed by the American proposal to arm his political enemies. He asked Roosevelt to call Stilwell, who gave him the news. So Stilwell was replaced by General Albert Wedmeyer, and Major General Patrick Hurley came to China as a presidential envoy to assist him. And Hurley became the acting ambassador. Ambassador Gauss, he went ahead and submitted his resignation. Now, this is one of the files I found in the photos I found in Barrett's file. It says Colonel Barrett with field glasses in Chongqing in common summer of 1944. On the back, Barrett typed this one, quote, "Ye asked me to look through them to see if I could discern any sign of U.S. support for the Chinese communists. I told him I could not." His sense of humor just carrying it through. Now, when Patrick Hurley came in and they had the news of the atomic bombing, the war was going to be over, and one by one, the Japanese had to surrender to the nationalist armies at the end of the war. There were over 1 million Japanese in China at the end of World War II. Now, Patrick Hurley was a good old boy from Oklahoma. This is him in the bow tie. This is Chute, and this is Mao Zedong. He was really in over his head, trying to negotiate with this small circle of leaders who'd survived 20 plus years of infighting to rise to the very top of the Communist Party hierarchy. He treated them as if they were country bumpkins, encouraging them to go down and talk to Chiang and the Nationalists, naively thinking they were no different than Democrats sitting down to chat with Republicans. So Mao eventually made the trip at Chiang's invitation. This is their last meeting in Chongqing in 1945. They tried to put up a good show of public face for the people, but after 6 weeks of negotiations, they showed a little bit of compromise, but in the end, it resolved nothing. Zhou Enlai had actually offered to withdraw the Red Army from southern China. That offer was ignored. Patrick Hurley gave Mao an ultimatum to incorporate their Chinese Communist Party into the army, which he flatly refused. He found it insulting. He began to turn against the United States. Hurley announced his resignation, and he accused the members of the Dixie Mission of undermining him in favoring the communists. Amongst the first political casualties on the American side was Colonel David Barrett, because of Barrett's role in the Dixie Mission had cost him a promotion. He had also had a nomination to bring him up from a full colonel to a brigadier general, but Hurley went and had him removed to a small corner of the China Theater for the rest of his service, and that was the beginning of the fallout of the McCarthy era in 1950. In the McCarthy era, during the 50s, hundreds of government employees, educators, entertainers, union activists were being accused by Senator Joseph McCarthy of being related to the communist movement. Jack Service was one. He was among those foreign service officers in China whose careers were destroyed as a result of the McCarthy hearings. In 1950, McCarthy singled out Jack Service as one of the 200 known communists in the State Department, blaming them for losing China. It was absurd. Secretary of State Dulles actually asked for Service's resignation. In 1951, John Carter Vincent was attacked by the Senator McCarthy, having been accused of being a member of the Communist Party. His career didn't end well either. My father-in-law, Paul Springer, had worked with every one of these guys, but he had gotten transferred to Cairo, Egypt in 1944. So he didn't suffer the same diplomatic fallout that these guys did. But I find it interesting after all these years that we see the persecution of this and the communists. If you want to find out how it really played out, take the next step. Order a copy of the book, Blackboards and Bomb Shelters. This is just one of those little side stories that I thought was really interesting, and I wanted to share with all of you and share to the people in the National Museum of the Pacific War. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us, Jim. And now is the time when, if we have any questions from our at-home audience, that we're going to move into that section. It looks like we already have one question. All right, so let's jump into that real quick. First question is, did the Americans understand the goal of the communists was to eventually take over China? Did they think Chiang would win the struggle and defeat the communists?
I don't know. I don't think they really understood the goal of the communists until after World War II. The Americans went back and had air flights. They had consistent air power and manpower to assist the Chinese nationalists in the struggle against the communists. So after 1946 and 47 and 48, they were Chenault had shifted his work from the 14th Air Force to supporting Chiang Kai-shek's government, and it was a losing battle because the communist movement at that point was way too big, and Chu Dai was the commander, and he knew exactly what he was doing to bring the people on his side.
Okay, I have a question. Since you have a personal tie to this story, I'm curious, is there anything that your father-in-law might wish that we understood about his experiences that we could take into our modern interpretation of what was going on at the time?
It was actually his book that I found among his things called The China Hands that described the Dixie Mission behind the scenes, because Colonel Barrett he was a civilian and he wanted to get in the war effort. And Colonel Barrett had actually offered him an officer's commission as a first lieutenant, and the State Department would not let him go and would not let him go because he said Gal said, I can't hire anybody out here. I can't get anybody to replace him. So he was stuck with those guys. I mean, he had the same coat size as Jack Service. Colonel Barrett had offered him an officer's commission. John Carter Vincent hired him, and he worked under him, and he worked directly under Gauss. He knew all guys. I wish I had the opportunity to ask him, what he had thought, but he was an anti-communist hardliner after the war and into Vietnam, and very much so afterwards.
So the book that referenced blackboards and what I'm not entirely
Blackboards
sure what
and
the
bomb
question.
shelters. Hmm.
Okay, I think that's what they were asking. Blackboards and bomb shelters is the title of the book, and then we have another question. How good was the Communist Army in fighting the Japanese? Can you speak to that?
The Japanese were never able to make incursions into Yenan, but the Communist armies were never able to get rearmed. So they did not go on any huge military offenses at that point in time, but they were able to successfully hold off any significant Japanese incursions into Yan'an, into Shaanxi, into the region that they controlled. And as a matter of fact, I think I alluded to earlier, as the Japanese withdrew troops out of the area, they literally got right behind them, drove them out, captured their supplies, captured their guns, captured their ammo, captured whatever they could, and used that to reinforce their position. So it was like they were taking everything in reverse and rearming themselves. They were definitely an effective fighting force.
Did the American embassy staffers understand Chiang's political weaknesses vis-a-vis? And then there's a list of four names: Mao, Chu, Lin, and Chu.
Yeah, they understand that Chiang had a lot of political weaknesses. They did a really hard conscription policy of peasants, and they were so corrupt that if people could pay, they didn't get conscripted into the army. Had a lot of government controls. Every time you drove a car, you had to buy the tires from the governor, from the government, the gasoline for the government. There were no private vehicles in China at that point in time. Think now about communists, they're going to overthrow the private capital, if they take over. But in China at that point in time, there really was no private capital, or very little of it. So yeah, they were a corrupt regime. They weren't well liked. He was trying to hold it together, and the political movement was just too strong for Chiang to overcome, because even though the Americans rearmed Chiang and they didn't rearm the communists still took over. And they're still fighting that between Thailand and mainland China, but that's not a fight I'm going to get into.
What was the role of Madame Chiang?
What was the role of Madame Chiang? That was Chiang Kai-shek's
Mm-hmm.
wife, Sun
Mm-hmm.
Mi-ling, and she also spoke English very well, and she had a diplomatic role. There was a conference in Cairo that Chiang Kai-shek, Churchill, and Stalin attended. I believe it was Truman that attended it with them, and she absolutely charmed Churchill. So she played the diplomatic wife, the first lady of China, and so forth. And my mother-in-law, Paul Springer's wife, actually did her master's thesis as a biography on her at Stanford University back in the 50s. So I don't know. That's something else. She had a very important role in keeping Chiang Kai-shek's regime alive.
Okay. All right. I am going to cut us off at this point. We have released and updated our website in regards to our conference. So this year's conference theme is Pop Culture, Propaganda, and Politics, Reflections on the Pacific War 80 Years Later. I would love to see you all there, either in person or virtually. We have tickets for both options, and the dates are October 17th and 18th. For more information, please check out our website. I would like to say one last thank you to our presenter, Jim, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.